By sunrise, she was gone, and the only thing she left behind was a list of names. Alpha King Alexander Hayes stood in the doorway of Emily Carter's empty room, staring at the narrow wooden desk beneath the window. The morning light was pale against the snow outside, but the room felt colder than the winter beyond the glass. Emily had disappeared without a farewell, without asking permission, and without leaving anyone a reason to follow her. Her bed was neatly made. Her gray winter coat was gone. Her boots were missing. There were no jewels, no letters, and no possessions that suggested she had planned to return. Alexander stepped inside and noticed a single sheet of paper resting on the desk. He picked it up. Names filled the page. Mrs. Bennet. Thomas Reed. The Miller family. The names of farmers, elderly residents, and families from distant northern settlements. Beside each name were only a few words. Medicine. Food. Firewood. Blankets. Alexander read the list again, his expression slowly changing. These were not royal guests or influential pack leaders. They were people most of the court barely remembered. Why had Emily been keeping track of them? Daniel Brooks, the palace steward, appeared quietly at the doorway. Your Majesty, the servants searched the eastern wing. No one saw her leave. Alexander kept his eyes on the paper. When was her room last occupied? Late last night. Did she take anything from the palace? Daniel hesitated. Only what belonged to her. Alexander looked toward the empty wardrobe. Then she planned this carefully. He walked to the window. Beyond the palace gardens, fresh snow covered the stone paths, erasing almost every footprint. Emily had always been easy to overlook. She rarely spoke during court gatherings. She never demanded attention. When others received praise, she stepped aside. When someone needed help, she quietly moved closer. Alexander remembered seeing her several times during the past winter. Once, she had carried a basket of supplies through the palace corridor. Another time, she had stood outside the infirmary with an elderly servant. He had noticed her, but he had never stopped to ask why she was there. Now. That memory unsettled him. Daniel approached the desk. There is something else. He pointed beneath the paper. A small envelope was tucked under the list. Alexander opened it carefully. There was no explanation, only one sentence written in Emily's handwriting. Please make sure they are not forgotten. Alexander stared at the words. Not forgotten. Who was she talking about? The people on the list? The northern settlements? Or perhaps someone she had never written down? He turned toward Daniel. Find every person on this list. All of them. Every name. Daniel nodded and left immediately. Alexander remained alone in the quiet room. For the first time, Emily's disappearance did not feel like an act of rejection. It felt like the beginning of a secret he had somehow been standing beside for months without seeing. He looked once more at the empty bed, then at the list in his hand. What did you do, Emily? Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the road she had taken. But somewhere beyond the palace walls, the first clue to her sacrifice was already waiting. By noon, every name on Emily's list had a story behind it. Alexander sat in the council chamber with the papers spread across the long oak table, while Daniel Brooks moved from one report to another. The first name belonged to Mrs. Bennet, an elderly widow living nearly 170 miles north of the capital. The palace records showed that she had received no royal assistance in 3 months. Yet beside her name, Emily had written 2 simple words, medicine delivered. Alexander looked up. Who delivered it? Daniel checked another record. There is no royal delivery listed. The answer left a quiet tension in the room. They continued. Thomas Reed, a farmer whose harvest had failed. The Miller family, living near Pine Hollow. A group of elderly residents in a settlement beyond the northern ridge. One by one, the names revealed the same pattern. Emily had been helping people who had fallen through the cracks of the kingdom's system. She had not announced it. She had not requested reimbursement. She had simply found a need and answered it. Daniel placed a small stack of receipts on the table. These were found in the palace infirmary. Alexander studied them. Most were for modest amounts. A few dollars for medicine. $10 for food. $15 for winter supplies. None of the purchases were large enough to attract attention. Together, however, they told a different story. How much did she spend? Alexander asked. Daniel calculated the total. Almost everything from her personal allowance over the past several months. Alexander leaned back slowly. Emily had never possessed much. She had been a rejected Omega, living quietly within a palace that had never truly felt like home. Yet she had been giving away what little she had. Why did nobody tell me? Alexander asked. Daniel's expression became uncomfortable. She asked the staff not to. Alexander looked toward the tall windows. Snow covered the palace courtyard, soft and bright beneath the winter sun. He remembered Emily standing there weeks earlier, carrying a small basket against her chest. He had assumed she was delivering something for the household. He had never asked. Now that memory felt painfully incomplete. Daniel opened another file. There is something else, Your Majesty. Inside was a supply report from the northern settlements. Several shipments had been delayed or marked as completed even though the villages had received nothing. Alexander's expression changed. How long? At least 3 months. He read the dates again. Emily's first recorded purchase had appeared shortly after the earliest missing shipment. A quiet connection formed in his mind. She had not simply been helping random people. She had discovered that something was wrong. Where is the northern office? Alexander asked. Nearly 200 miles from here. Then we are going there. Daniel looked surprised. Today. Alexander folded the report and placed it inside his coat. Today. Before leaving, he returned to Emily's list. At the very bottom was one final name. Alexander Hayes. Beside it, Emily had written nothing. He stared at his own name for several seconds. Why had she written it? What had she wanted him to understand? Daniel waited near the door. Your Majesty. Alexander finally folded the paper. Find out where she went. He walked into the winter sunlight, carrying the list that had begun as a mystery. Now it felt like a trail. And somewhere beyond the northern roads, Emily was still following the truth alone. The road north stretched beneath a pale winter sky, and by late afternoon, the royal carriage had traveled nearly 170 miles from the capital. Alexander sat in silence, Emily's list folded inside his coat. Daniel Brooks rode beside him, reviewing the supply records they had collected before leaving. Every mile brought them closer to the settlements Emily had been helping, yet Alexander still could not understand why she had chosen to disappear instead of asking for help. When they reached Mrs. Bennet's small farmhouse, an elderly woman opened the door and stared at the royal crest on Alexander's coat. Your Majesty, she whispered. Alexander inclined his head. I am looking for Emily Carter. The woman's expression softened immediately. Then you finally came. Alexander paused. You knew she was gone. Mrs. Bennet stepped aside. She told me you might come looking for her. Inside, the house was warm but modest. A small fire burned in the stone hearth, and a jar of medicine rested beside a child's cup on the wooden table. Alexander recognized the handwriting on the label. Emily's. She brought this, Mrs. Bennet said. She paid for it herself. Alexander looked at the medicine. When was she here? 2 days ago. The answer settled one concern immediately. Emily had not left the northern settlements weeks ago. She had been moving between them. Mrs. Bennet continued, she has been visiting several families. She brings medicine when she can, food when she has enough, and sometimes she helps repair things around the house. Alexander looked toward the window. Did she tell you where she was going? North. Toward Pine Hollow. Daniel opened the supply records. That is one of the settlements listed in the missing shipments. Mrs. Bennet nodded. Emily knew something was wrong. She asked me whether the royal wagons had arrived. Alexander felt the pieces align. Emily had not simply noticed suffering. She had noticed a pattern. Did she seem frightened? He asked. Mrs. Bennet shook her head. Tired, yes. Frightened, no. She reached beneath the table and brought out a small envelope. She left this for you. Alexander opened it carefully. Inside was a short note. Please do not look for me until everyone is safe. He read it twice. Why would she say that? Mrs. Bennet looked at him with quiet understanding. Because she did not want you to waste time searching for her. Alexander folded the note. She thought helping these people mattered more than being found. Yes, Mrs. Bennet replied. That sounds like Emily. As Alexander stepped outside, Daniel approached him. There is a road leading directly to Pine Hollow. It is about 20 miles from here. Alexander looked toward the snowy mountains. Then we continue. The carriage moved north again as evening settled over the trees. Along the way, they passed small homes with thin trails of smoke rising from their chimneys. Some had fresh firewood stacked beside the doors. Others had bundles of supplies resting beneath covered porches. Daniel recognized several items from the palace inventory. Emily had somehow found ways to move them where they were needed. Alexander watched the quiet homes pass by. The woman everyone had called insignificant had been leaving signs of care across an entire region. Then, through the falling snow, a small lantern appeared between the trees. Daniel pointed toward it. Pine Hollow. Alexander looked at the light and felt something change inside him. They were close. Very close. And somewhere beyond that lantern, Emily was still carrying a secret she had never intended the Alpha King to discover. By the time they reached Pine Hollow, darkness had settled over the northern forest. Snow covered the narrow road, and the small settlement appeared almost hidden among the towering pine trees. Alexander stepped from the carriage and looked around. Several homes stood along the main road, each with a small trail of smoke rising from its chimney. There was no royal supply wagon in sight. No official escort. No sign that the kingdom had remembered this place at all. Then Alexander noticed something else. Fresh footprints. Crossed the snow beside the road. Small boots. One person traveling alone. He followed them toward the edge of the settlement, where an old ranger station stood beneath the trees. A warm glow shone through one window. She is here, Daniel said quietly. Alexander did not answer. He walked toward the building and stopped several feet from the door. Through the window, he could see Emily. She was sitting beside an elderly man, carefully preparing medicine in a small cup. Her long light brown hair was loosely tied behind her shoulders, and her gray winter coat hung over the back of a chair. She looked exhausted. Yet her expression remained calm. A young girl sat nearby, holding a blanket around her shoulders. Emily handed her a bowl of warm food and smiled. The sight stopped Alexander completely. He had expected to find someone desperate to return home. Instead, he found the same quiet Omega who had spent months giving away pieces of her own life. Daniel whispered, "Should we go inside?" Alexander shook his head. Wait. He wanted to see what she would do when no one was watching. Emily opened a small canvas bag and removed several medicine bottles. She counted them carefully. There were only a few left. She placed one beside the elderly man's bed, another near the little girl's blanket, and then stared at the empty space inside the bag. Her shoulders lowered slightly. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small silver coin. She held it for a moment, then placed it on the table beside the medicine. Alexander's expression changed. "That was her last money," Daniel whispered. Emily did not know they were watching. She simply closed the bag and stood. The elderly man looked at her. "You should keep that for yourself." Emily smiled gently. "Someone else needs it more." Alexander looked away for a moment. Those words were painfully simple. She had nothing left, yet she was still thinking about someone else. Then Emily crossed the room and lifted an old blanket from a chair. She folded it carefully and placed it beside the little girl. Her hands trembled from exhaustion, but she continued. She did not complain. She did not ask for recognition. She simply kept going. Alexander finally understood that her disappearance had not been an escape. Emily had left because she believed staying near the palace would make it harder to help the people who needed her. She had chosen the northern road instead. She had chosen them. But there was another mystery. Why had the royal shipment stopped reaching Pine Hollow? Daniel opened the records again. The last delivery was marked complete 3 months ago. Alexander looked through the window at Emily, then at the empty supply shelves inside the station. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Emily had discovered something the royal court had failed to see. And before she could tell anyone, she had disappeared into the snow to handle it alone. "You found it," Emily whispered, before Alexander could say a word. She had heard the door open. She turned from the table, and her tired eyes met his across the warm lantern light. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Emily looked toward the empty medicine shelves, as if the sight of the Alpha King standing there mattered less than the people still waiting for help. Alexander stepped inside slowly. "You left without telling anyone." Emily lowered her gaze. "I did not want anyone to follow me." "Why?" She glanced at the elderly man resting nearby and the child wrapped in a blanket. "Because they needed help." Alexander looked at the small medicine bag on the table. "And you thought you could provide it alone?" Emily hesitated. "I thought I could do something." Alexander walked closer, but stopped several feet away. "You used your own money." "Most of it." "Your food?" Emily nodded. "Your winter coat?" A faint, embarrassed smile appeared on her face. "Someone needed it." Alexander looked at the thin sweater beneath her coat. "And the coin?" Emily looked toward the table. "For medicine." Daniel stepped inside carrying the Northern Supply records. "Your Majesty, I found the delivery reports." Alexander took them and began reading. The documents showed that royal shipments had been marked as delivered for 3 consecutive months, but the settlement records showed that many families had received nothing. Emily watched his expression change. "I found the same thing," she said quietly. Alexander looked at her. "How?" "I asked the families. Then I compared their records with the notices posted at the village office." She reached beneath the table and brought out a small bundle of papers. "These are copies of the missing delivery notices." Alexander studied them carefully. "Why did you not send these to the palace?" Emily looked down. "I tried." "What happened?" "My first message never received an answer. The second one was returned." Daniel frowned. "Returned by whom?" Emily shook her head. "I do not know." Alexander looked at the papers again. The situation was no longer a simple supply problem. Someone had allowed the northern settlements to be overlooked, and Emily had been quietly filling the gap. "You should have told me directly," he said. Emily gave him a tired smile. "Would you have listened?" The question was gentle, not accusing. Still, Alexander had no answer. He remembered every time he had seen her in the palace and failed to ask what she was doing. Emily continued, "You had hundreds of people bringing you problems. I did not think mine would matter." Alexander slowly lowered the papers. "You were never a problem." Emily looked at him, surprised. "Then why did I feel like one?" The room became quiet. Even the fire seemed softer. Alexander had no easy answer, because the truth was uncomfortable. He had been part of a world that had taught Emily to expect nothing. He had allowed her to become invisible simply by never looking closely enough. Emily picked up the medicine bag. "I only wanted these people to get through the winter." Alexander looked at the nearly empty bag. "And you?" She smiled faintly. "I will manage." But Alexander could see that she had already given away nearly everything she had. He looked at Daniel. "Bring every available medical supply to Pine Hollow. Contact the northern settlements. Start a full review of every missing shipment." Then he turned back to Emily. "You are not doing this alone anymore." Emily stared at him, unsure whether to believe him. For the first time since she disappeared, she allowed herself to wonder whether returning home might not mean returning to the same life she had left behind. The words stayed with Emily long after Alexander finished speaking. "You are not doing this alone anymore." She had heard promises before, but they had rarely lasted. She stood beside the small wooden table, watching Daniel organize the northern records while the first signs of dawn appeared beyond the frosted window. Alexander had not left. He had remained in the ranger station, speaking with the villagers, checking the supply lists, and listening to concerns that had gone unheard for months. Emily watched him quietly. This was the Alpha King she had always known from a distance, the ruler everyone respected and feared disappointing. Yet here, in a small cabin far from the palace, he seemed different. He was listening. Truly listening. An elderly resident told him about families who had been sharing firewood. A farmer explained how his children had been going without certain foods. Alexander wrote each concern into a small notebook. He did not dismiss a single one. When he finally returned to Emily, she was standing near the window. "You are going back with me," he said gently. Emily looked at him. "Back to the palace?" "Back to the capital, yes. But not as the woman who left." She frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" Alexander held up the northern records. "It means these settlements will no longer depend on someone quietly sacrificing herself to survive." Emily lowered her eyes. "I did not mind helping." "I know." His voice softened. "That is what worries me." She looked up. "Why?" "Because you thought giving everything away was the only way you could matter." Emily went still. The words touched something she had never admitted aloud. "I never thought about it that way." Alexander looked at her steadily. "You should have been allowed to keep something for yourself." She looked down at her hands. "No one ever taught me that." Alexander was silent for a moment. "Then perhaps someone should have." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away. "Why do you care now?" Alexander did not answer immediately. He looked toward the elderly residents, the child near the fire, and the nearly empty medicine shelves. "Because I finally understand what I failed to see." Emily waited. "You were never weak," he said. "You were carrying responsibilities no one should have expected you to carry alone." Her breath caught. For years, she had been told that her quiet nature made her insignificant. Now the Alpha King was describing that same quietness as strength. Alexander stepped toward the doorway. "Come with me, Emily." She hesitated. "And if I refuse?" He turned back. "Then I will make sure you are safe here. Your choice will be respected." Emily studied his face. There was no command in his voice. Only sincerity. For the first time, she realized he was not asking her to return because she owed the palace anything. He was asking because he wanted her there. She looked around the ranger station one final time. The people she had helped were smiling now because the royal supply wagons would soon arrive. Emily felt something inside her loosen. She had come north believing she needed to disappear to make a difference. Now she understood something else. She did not need to disappear anymore. She could remain herself and still be seen. Alexander waited without rushing her. Finally, Emily nodded. "All right. I will come home." And when she stepped outside beside him, the morning sun touched the snowy road ahead, revealing a path neither of them had expected to take. The royal carriage reached the capital just before sunset, and Emily watched the familiar palace gates slowly come into view. Her hands rested quietly in her lap as memories returned. She remembered standing in these halls with her eyes lowered, trying not to draw attention. She remembered the whispers, the dismissive looks, and the feeling that she could disappear without anyone noticing. This time, however, she was not returning alone. Alexander rode beside the carriage, and the Northern Supply records traveled with them. When the gates opened, servants and council members gathered in the courtyard. The news of Emily's return had already spread. She stepped from the carriage, expecting the old whispers to return. Instead, the courtyard became strangely quiet. Alexander approached her and offered his hand. Emily hesitated for only a moment before accepting it. Together, they entered the great hall. Daniel had arranged the northern records across a long table, and Alexander had summoned the royal council. Several council members looked surprised to see Emily standing beside the Alpha King. One elderly official frowned. "Your Majesty, why has the Omega been brought before the council?" Alexander turned toward him. "Because this concerns every person in the northern settlements." Emily remained silent as Daniel opened the first report. He read the dates of the missing shipments, the settlements affected, and the repeated requests that had never received proper attention. Then he placed Emily's records beside them. Her handwritten notes matched the dates of the shortages. A quiet realization spread through the room. Alexander looked at the council. While our official records showed that supplies were being delivered, Emily Carter was traveling nearly 170 miles from the capital to provide what our system had failed to provide. No one interrupted. She used her own money. She gave away food. She found medicine. She helped families who had no reason to believe anyone in the palace even knew their names. Emily lowered her eyes. She wished he would stop. She had never wanted the room to hear these things. Alexander noticed her discomfort. "Emily did not ask me to say any of this," he continued. "She did not ask for a title, recognition, or reward. She simply believed that someone should care." An official near the end of the table shifted uneasily. "But Your Majesty, she is an Omega without noble training." Alexander looked directly at him. "And yet she found a failure in our northern system before this council did." The room became silent. Daniel placed the final document on the table. "These are the supply requests Emily collected herself." Alexander looked at Emily, then back at the council. "From this day forward, the northern settlements will receive direct royal support. A formal investigation will review every missing shipment, and Emily Carter will serve as the royal advisor overseeing the needs of those communities." Emily looked up in surprise. She had expected gratitude perhaps, but not responsibility. Alexander turned toward her. "Only if you want it." The entire room seemed to disappear for a moment. He was not commanding her. He was asking. Emily slowly looked around the hall. These were the same people who had once overlooked her. Yet she no longer felt the need to shrink beneath their attention. She took a breath. "I will do it." Alexander nodded. "Then it is settled." For the first time, Emily stood in the center of the royal hall without wondering whether she belonged there. She had not returned as a forgotten Omega asking for a place. She had returned as the woman who had earned the right to choose where she stood. And before the night was over, the Alpha King would give her one more choice, one that had nothing to do with the northern settlements and everything to do with her future. That night, Emily stood alone in the palace garden, watching the moonlight settle across the snow-covered paths. The events of the day still felt unreal. She had returned to the capital, spoken before the council, and accepted a position she had never imagined receiving. Yet one question remained. Why had Alexander asked her to meet him here after everyone else had gone to sleep? Footsteps sounded behind her. Emily turned and saw the Alpha King approaching beneath the old oak tree. He was no longer wearing the formal coat he had worn before the council. Instead, he wore a simple dark winter coat, making him look less like a distant ruler and more like the man she had met in the quiet ranger station. "You wanted to see me," Emily said. Alexander nodded. "I did." He stopped a respectful distance away. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then he looked toward the palace. "Today, you stood before the council and accepted a responsibility that should never have belonged to you alone." Emily smiled faintly. "The people still need help." "They do." Alexander looked at her. "And you will help them. But there is something else I need to say." Emily waited. "I have spent a long time believing that protecting people meant making decisions for them." His voice was calm. "I thought being king meant knowing what was best for everyone." Emily lowered her eyes. "And now? Now I know that sometimes protection means giving someone the freedom to decide for themselves." She looked up. Alexander took a slow breath. "Emily, I want you to stay at the palace. Not because you are my advisor. Not because the council now respects you. And not because of what you sacrificed." Her expression softened. "Then why?" He met her eyes. "Because I want you here." The words were simple. They carried no command. Emily felt her heart tighten. For most of her life, people had told her where she belonged. Some had told her she did not belong anywhere. Now the Alpha King was offering something completely different. A choice. "What would staying mean?" she asked. Alexander answered carefully. "It could mean nothing more than friendship. It could mean working together for the northern settlements. Or, if one day you wanted something more, we could discover that together." Emily looked toward the moonlit garden. "And if I leave? Then I will still make sure the northern settlements receive everything they need." He paused. "And I will still respect you." Emily turned back to him. There was no pressure in his expression. No expectation. Only patience. "You really mean that?" "I do." She smiled softly. "No one has ever given me a choice like this." Alexander's expression became gentle. "Then you should have one now." Emily walked slowly toward the garden gate, thinking about the woman who had left the palace days before. That woman had believed disappearing was the only way to help others. She had believed her worth came from what she could sacrifice. But the woman standing beneath the moon now understood something different. She could give without losing herself. She could care for others without abandoning her own life. She could remain beside someone without becoming smaller. Emily turned toward Alexander. "I do not know what the future looks like." "Neither do I," he replied. She smiled. "Then perhaps we can find out." Alexander offered his hand. Emily looked at it for a moment, then placed her hand in his. There was no ceremony. No audience. No crown. Only a quiet choice made beneath the winter moon. And for Emily, that simple choice meant more than any title ever could. 3 weeks later, the first winter supply convoy reached Pine Hollow under the new royal system, and Emily stood at the village entrance watching families receive the food, medicine, blankets, and firewood they had once been forced to wait for. She felt something warm settle in her chest. Not pride exactly. Relief. For the first time, helping people did not require her to disappear. She could remain visible and still make a difference. Daniel had helped establish the new northern office, while Emily had begun visiting each settlement and listening directly to the families who lived there. The work was demanding, but she no longer carried it alone. Every few days, Alexander received her reports and personally reviewed the progress. He never questioned her judgment simply because she was an Omega. Instead, he asked what she needed. That small change meant more to Emily than any title. One evening, she returned to the palace after a long day in the northern district. Snow covered the courtyard, and warm golden light filled the windows. Alexander was waiting beneath the old oak tree where they had spoken weeks earlier. Emily walked toward him with a quiet smile. "You are still here. I said I would wait." She stopped beside him. "The northern families received everything this week." Alexander smiled. "I read your report." Emily looked toward the palace. "It still feels strange." "What does?" "Being listened to." Alexander's expression softened. "You should never have had to wonder whether your voice mattered." Emily looked down for a moment. Then she lifted her eyes. "I used to think I had to give everything away before anyone could see my worth." Alexander stepped closer, leaving enough space for her to choose whether to remain. "And now?" Emily smiled. "Now I know I can help people without losing myself." He nodded. "That is all I ever wanted for you." Emily studied his face. "Only that?" A quiet smile appeared on his lips. "I also hoped you might choose to stay." She looked toward the snowy garden, then back at him. "I already did." The words were soft, but Alexander understood. He offered his hand, and Emily accepted it. There was no grand ceremony. No demand from the council. No expectation that she needed to become someone different. Their future would be built slowly, through trust, respect, and choices made together. Emily had once believed disappearing was the only way to protect the people she loved. Now she understood that she could stand beside them without sacrificing herself. She could be an Omega without being diminished. She could serve without being forgotten. And she could stand beside an Alpha King without becoming invisible beneath his shadow. Alexander looked toward the lights of the palace. "Come inside. It is cold." Emily laughed softly. "You finally noticed." "I notice more now." She smiled at him, and together they walked toward the palace doors. Behind them, snow settled gently across the garden, covering the footprints they had made. Ahead of them, warm light waited. Emily did not know exactly what the future would bring, and for once, she was not afraid of that uncertainty. She had spent years believing that love had to be earned through sacrifice. Now she knew something better. Her worth had never depended on what she could give away. She had been worthy before anyone recognized her, strong before anyone called her strong, and deserving before the Alpha King ever reached for her hand. And this time, when she walked into the light, she did not disappear.